thank you. Okay, I've got a talk, I have some slides. I have no idea how long it's going to take. I could have called this talk, "What the hell is happening? What on earth should we do?" Mostly, what I want to do is share some of my thoughts with you and use this as an opportunity to get your feedback, maybe in the conversations later, on how I'm thinking about this stuff, because I think there's a lot going on. And I was trying to think about why I wanted to come and talk. And mostly it's because right now we're in a moment where there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think the best thing we can do is share our thoughts about what's going on and help each other and try and see if the way we're thinking about this makes sense to ourselves and what we should do about it. So at the end, I'd like us to think about what we can all do when we go out of this room today, and how we can share what we're doing, what we're thinking. And so most of my talk isn't about implementing AI governance. It's mostly a narrative about how I'm thinking about this stuff as a lead up to then explain what we're trying to do at BMJ. But I'm really open. I want to know, do you think what we're doing is the right approach? What are you all doing? What should we all be doing together? I don't know. So that's why I came here to talk. So before I do this, I'm just going to ask, I'm pretty sure most people here have been working with these tools and using them. It's just, I'm not even going to ask that question. But put up your hand if you are overly optimistic. Okay, a few people. Put up your hand if you're worried or a little bit concerned. Okay, so we've got a bit of a mix, right? There isn't a clear consensus. And our conferences over the last couple of years have overwhelmingly been about stuff like transformative agreements, the move to OA, business models, a little sidestep into blockchain for a while, But this is an area where so much is happening and there's so much uncertainty that I feel it's a really weird and odd place to be a technologist. It's really interesting. So I'm going to start talking about a paper that came out in April. And I guess part of my thinking here is things are quite strange. How do we get to a place where they're less strange? How do we get to a place where things are a bit more boring? So I'm going to talk you through the key points of this paper to start with. It came out in April, but I think most of the points still hold. Right? And when it came out, GPT had only been in the public for about 3 months, but now it's been a year. So it's been 12 months, and so we can say that the pace of change is very insane. I apologize for the color. I realize it's a terrible color, but I'll keep going anyway. LLMs predictably get more capable with increasing investment, which means they are going to get more capable than they are today. That's for sure. Much of the behavior in them is emergent. It's unpredictable. It's not connected directly to the increasing investment. So basically, we don't know why this happens. It just does. They don't appear to learn and use representation. They often appear to learn and use representation of the outside world. And David commented on this. And I've got a lot of thoughts about that I won't go into because that'll be a whole other talk. So they look like they're intelligent, even if they're not. There's no reliable technique for us to steer their behavior today, which means we don't know how to control them. Experts are not yet able to interpret the inner workings of LLMs, which means we don't know how they work. Human performance on a task is not an upper bound to how well they perform, which means they will be better at us at many things and already are. They do not need to express the views of their creators, and values are not encoded into them. And so they're just a tool, and they will be used as a tool. And brief interactions with these tools often lead to misunderstanding. So you should spend time with them to try and get to understand how they work. And that paper came out in April. It's beautifully written, highly recommend it. And everything in that paper still holds through to today. Oh, a question?
I've lost the reference of that paper.
I'm sure we will share the slides. Yeah, I'm sure we will. Okay, and so we can kind of think about 4 potential future scenarios about this stuff, right? They're either going to stay the same, but this is already out of date, right? Since yesterday, they're not staying the same. They're definitely getting better. And I think in April, there was a question in our minds, would they get incrementally better or would they get dramatically better? And at the moment, number 3 is trending here. And there's a whole bunch of stuff around. At the moment, we're seeing dramatic increases in text-based models with the beginnings of multimodal models that work well with video and audio and images. And we're only even beginning to open the door on that part. And then there's a fourth idea that maybe they become sentient. But irrespective of anything here, what we can say with certainty is we're not going back. The world, from the point of view of technologists, certainly has changed. It's definitely changed. And I've been a big fanboy of technology for a long time. And I've made lots of incorrect predictions. I've stood up, and my big one was Google Wave. I was a big fan of Google Wave, and all sorts of stuff. And but this time it's different, I guess, maybe? Right. So let's talk about these kind of three scenarios for the future. And yes, I've used DALL-E 3, and I haven't even decided to even credit it. DALL-E 3 in almost everything now. So there is this kind of view that they may be existentially risky to us. But I just want to say, and if you see the narrative that came out of the AI Summit, I'm worried about this narrative because I think it detracts us from what we can do. And also, it's not grounded in any evidence. It's not grounded in any verifiable way. The statements about the kinds of harms these tools can produce are non-verifiable. And if you were a philosopher of science, you would say they are ascientific in terms of the statements that are being made. But it's a strong narrative, and it also plays into this question I asked earlier about the potential for regulatory capture. The organizations that are messaging this hard are actually the ones that are already in the lead, and if they can put regulation in place, it can potentially solidify their position in market. So I think we have to be very careful about this narrative and not get distracted about this from the perspective of what we in this room can do and what control we have in how this technology gets formed and how we deploy it in our organizations and in our communities. But it's certainly a view that is common. This is a different view that I like. Again, it has some problems with it. And so this is a view that was put to me by, and again, I'm just trying to share my thoughts about this stuff, right? There isn't a huge narrative to this talk, but this is a view I really liked. It's from a labor economist in New York who's a friend of mine. Her point is that we call our economies knowledge economies. We call about knowledge industries. How would you measure the GDP of a knowledge industry? What's the unit of productivity in a knowledge industry? And her point of view is the unit of productivity has to be the ideas that we have. And so how do you grow an economy? If it's a knowledge economy, you have to think about how you create more capacity in that economy for better ideas. That's it. If you are a knowledge economy, it's a measure of the volume of good ideas in the economy, and you grow that by immigration, more people, better training, better education, or giving people more time to think more high-quality thoughts. And so there is a question here. Do these tools free us from the kinds of work that is detracting from our ability to spend quality time thinking the things that drive the economy forward? So there's a lot of debates around what the future of the economies will be with these tools. Is this a potential future that they free us up to think more? And I like that. That's a really interesting perspective. Should be measurable, right? We should be able to do economic studies to see whether this stuff happens. And there's quite a lot of work coming out that shows the use of these tools helps bring up the median level of people in knowledge work. So particularly in the application in legal fields, it makes mediocre to poor lawyers operate better than current mean and average. So maybe there is something here. But I worry a little bit about this picture, which is I feel sometimes these tools are actually just going to be an amplifying mirror of ourselves. And so I hear this narrative, like, they're going to free up our time so we can do better stuff. Email was supposed to do that, right? And actually, Google have a product that's coming out now. It's already out if you pay for it, where you can send an avatar to a meeting on your behalf, give it the notes that you want it to inject into the meeting, and it will take notes and bring it back to you. I mean, we're only moments away where some poor sod is going to be the only person in a meeting with 10 avatars that person has to reply to. We know that's going to happen. And so I think that what we'll find, actually, is these tools will amplify our own intrinsic behaviors. If you're the kind of person who has been the ability to make time for yourself to think, you're going to find these tools really helpful. But if you're the kind of person who's like, I'm super busy and I'm going to get more done and I'm going to write more reports, you're going to write even more reports. And I don't know if that's going to lead to the previous picture that we saw. So we have to, I think about this a little bit. And then I like this. This is not, GPT did not write this. I nicked this from some other presentation somewhere, but I've modified it a bit. This is kind of a view on how these tools might disrupt different types of industries today. And I think this picture is going to change quite a lot, actually, over time. And so the idea is the more grammatical the work is that you do, and the more predictable, those are the roles that right now are at risk. And software engineering is right up there at the top, because almost every line of software that anyone in your organization is writing has already been written at a line-by-line level, almost certainly. And actually, for me, one of the really remarkable things about this is you look at our entire world's industry, right? It's all digital. All that code has been written by someone sitting at a terminal, looking at the screen, typing it in, handing it over to someone else to have a check at. It's a cottage industry. We haven't hit the industrial revolution of software engineering, and this is the beginning of that. And so that's something to think about. Tax preparation, customer support, contracting, already we're seeing those being deployed. And so people who are working in your frontline support, they need to think, or you need to think differently about what those folks are doing. You know? But there's other kinds of work that won't get disrupted because, as we've talked about, these devices, I saw someone talk about this on Monday of last week. They've encoded perception, and so they can perceive far better than we can, but there's no intentionality or action in there, and they're just dumb in that way. They can't act, and so disordered ad hoc activities are beyond the capability, and probably, I think, always will be, actually. But here's another perspective I want to say about what I think these tools can do. One of the interesting things to me is we've often defined expertise as a way that we have shaped ourselves to technology. And so I like the example of Photoshop because it's a very complicated piece of software. And there are people who are experts at Photoshop. What does it mean to be an expert at Photoshop? It means that you've gone in and you have trained yourself to learn about all of the nuances that are in that interface. Up until today, or recently, software has been inflexible, and expertise has come from us shaping ourselves to that software. And so there are people who are experts in tax preparation or Excel or Photoshop because they know the ins and outs of those tools. They have trained themselves, they have molded themselves to the tools. And by creating a language layer which can take intentionality and make it operate on tasks in a digital realm, we kind of melt those interfaces and we make the interfaces more flexible. We begin to create softwares that can mold themselves to our intention. What that means is people in our organizations who derive their own self-worth from that type of expertise, that expertise will be at risk. Doesn't mean they don't have value to provide, but it does mean that we have to rethink the concept of expertise because this is a fundamental change in how we interact with the digital world. And I think that's an interesting perspective as well. But we're kind of going back to the future a little bit. It is a bit like the olden days. In the beginning was the command line. And okay, hands up, how many people here have worked on a command line? Brilliant, most people. So what I have found in working with command lines is that it's like invoking magic. I want to do something, I need to know the spell. What's the correct incantation that I write into that terminal? And once you know that incantation, magic can happen. And I feel like we're almost back here again now with prompting. We're kind of like, we have this amazingly powerful capability, and yet understanding things like if I might make my prompt emotionally manipulative, it makes the device work better because it's encoded language, and language is an inherently emotional medium. It's really interesting. So we're kind of back to having the most powerful and incredible piece of technology, and yet we kind of need to reimagine incantations and operate a little bit of magic with it. And so this is really bad visualization, but there's this really interesting question, which is, are the skills that are embedded in these languages, do they need to be unbundled at some point so that we can take specific kind of skills that these large language models have and figure out where we can place them within our ecosystems or within our organizations or within our workflows to create real value for our communities, for our missions, for our organizations, for our researchers. And today, there's just this operating level being built, but I feel there's a big gap yet to go between what's capable at this foundational level and how it will be applied in very specific areas inside of our organizations. And there's a great, great post by Benedict Evans on this about unbundling AI, which is where I took this idea from, and I'll add that in somewhere. Okay, so just thinking about this picture, going back to this one, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about implications for our industry and then what we're doing at BMJ. And a lot of what we're doing has been sort of informed by my thinking that I've talked about here so far, which is part of the reasons why I put all that stuff in. So when we do research, it's a disorganized ad hoc activity, but when we write research, it's extremely grammatical and fairly predictable. And so this is why we're making fake papers easy to do, but they don't mean anything. So that's this. So the way I think about this is how certain are we that stuff is happening and how disruptive might that stuff be? So, I've got a pointer. This is brilliant. Okay, so we are certain that papers are being generated that are fake. What's happening? But overall, it's not that disruptive to our industry. It's just happening. It's happening anyway. More of it's going to happen. It's not going to put us out of business. It's just something we've got to deal with. This stuff in the middle, how we interact with information internally inside of our organizations, how we scale workflow, we intuit that there's a lot of opportunity here, but we don't really know how disruptive it could be. It could be a 2x, 3x increase in productivity for organizations. Not really sure. It's an area that we need to investigate. It's also an area that's entirely in our control within our organizations. Entirely. It's quite nice. We can apply funding pots. We can step up teams. We can look at our own workflows. We can create the permission structure within our organization to experiment in this area. This stuff here is the stuff that's potentially highly disruptive. Will it change the context of our customers, of our researchers, and how they want to interact with information? Is there a market opportunity that could be significant for the kinds of work we do in terms of the kinds of licensing opportunities of selling into organizations? And I've had anecdotal discussions around customer context where people building systems which take longer form questions through retrieval augmented generation and then suggest similar questions back, similar but slightly different questions back, are beginning to change the behavior of people interacting with the information. And the reason this stuff is potentially so disruptive is it's the change in market and it's the change in the expectation of our customers, and that demands that we change, but we don't know how yet. So that's really interesting. So in what we did in BMJ is we briefed our board at the beginning of the year, kind of April, May. We brought in somebody called Matt Webb, who presented this as a framework for what we should be doing. And I'm very happy for this to be shared. And it's this idea that we should be looking for a systematic search for value, methodically within the organization, sharing knowledge internally, try to understand where the risks are, share what we're doing with partners, so this is part of the reasons why I'm here to talk, and try to make change easy inside the organization by making data more easily operable and usable inside the organization. That's for an organization of our scale, that one is the hardest because all of our engineering capacity is at limit and we don't have much. So it's my problem to worry about though as CTO. So this is how I think we get boring, is we kind of think about it in this way. And we start to ask this question, what can we do in our organizations and what control can we have? And how do we think about those sort of domains of where our own leverage is and how do we work safely in those contexts? I've forgotten what the message of that slide is. Oh no, so this is, so organizations, right, though, organizations love structure and they love safety and they want certainty and want to operate in a way where the organization feels it has some level of accountability. And so one of the things our board asked is, well, what's the governance going to be as you start to work with this? How can we be sure that you're going to do this safely? And so that's part of the thing that we've got to think about. We've got to think about how do we set up the way that we can work with these tools that meets the organizational's id around how this should happen. And so this was sort of an example of the kinds of activities that I suggested at the beginning of the year would be okay to think about. Work with extreme caution around things that are key in decision making. For mechanical tasks, just do this already. For things around augmentation, try to understand and exploit the opportunities in that area. But we went through some iterations and actually set up a governance group within BMJ. And we've written policy documents inside of BMJ and talked about the kind of governance structures that we should have and what the remit of that governance group should be. And a good question is, why regulate this technology compared to another technology? And I think you've got to start with that. You've got to ask, you've got to be able to explain to folk in your organization, why are you making the decision that we're going to actually have a process here? Because there's already so many processes inside of any given organization. And our answer to that is, firstly, as I've said now in the last 20 or so minutes, there's a lot of uncertainty here, both organizationally, individually, in terms of impacts on economies, workflow. But we also know that the tools can easily generate very plausible looking content. And as an organization that stands by everything we publish, our reputation is the highest value item that we have. And so because we have a combination of uncertainty and a risk to reputation if we leak content that isn't verified, that's our justification for governance at this point in time. Now, that may change, and we will come back and review our stances and reasons behind this, but that's our stated reasoning behind putting governance in place. And we say to folk in a company, if you're working with personal data, if you're working on stuff that could disrupt an existing workflow, or if you're working on anything that has an output that is seen by the general public, those are the kinds of use cases that we want to go through a governance process, where we ask and check with the teams who are working in this way, have they thought about the risks, and are they putting in place the right kinds of mitigations against those risks? If you're working in ideas that don't fall into those three categories, we try to create some resources, let people know what others have done, point to tools that we think have been verified by our legal team, point back to the use cases that have been approved, and we hope that outside of those kinds of areas of working, we get as many people as possible trying to understand the implications of these tools. So that's basically it in a nutshell. And in terms of governance, we've created a smallish group, and we've picked a representation from editorial, but not from all the journals. A representative from our UX team who has to think about the potential harms to users. We have someone in the organization who has experience with governance in NHS. We have someone in our marketing team who thinks about what the reputational risk to BMJ should be, legal representation in tech. And this is it. So we wanted a group that had a good balance of different perspectives, but not make it overly bureaucratic. And so we meet when a new use case comes in. We've been meeting almost weekly. We've had about 10 use cases over the summer that we've had to look at. That's how we operate. And we look at the idea, we examine it from these perspectives, we try and see if there are recommendations we can give, and then hopefully try and greenlight as many of those use cases as we can. And we're seeing use cases around software development, analyzing reporting, experimenting with copy editing, and a few others. But what I'd say at the moment is most of the uses that we're seeing are very much just using, this is a reference to Heidegger, by the way, just like very subtle. They're using tools that are ready to hand. They're just using the off-the-shelf stuff. How do I use OpenAI? How do I use Vertex AI? Where we haven't got to yet, and I think this is just a question of our scale, is we haven't got yet to the place where we're starting to engineer things into specific workflow. But I think that's where most of the opportunity lies, and that's where I need to get us to in the next, as soon as I can really, I suppose. So my conclusion to you all is this. Think in your organizations around where you have leverage around these kinds of questions. How can you make your organizations work in a way where there's a balanced view between risk and opportunity? And what are the things that are important to your organizations? And don't get distracted by the massive narrative that's going on. Think more in a pragmatic, centered way around, well, if I have this tool and I have these folks and I have these problems, how do we work safely? And so my question back to you all is, that's what we're doing. This is what I'm thinking. What do you all think? Are people doing it differently? Are people doing it, what am I missing? And when I asked the what am I missing question last, I got a really good piece of feedback, which was what I didn't represent here, and it's something we will talk about as we review our governance next time, is internally in the organization, how do we more proactively uncover the voices of people who are in our organization but would not naturally speak up, the slightly less represented communities inside of organizations and these things could affect. And so I've took that. That was a really good piece of feedback. You were there, Ian. That was Monday week ago. So yeah, those are my questions to you all. That's what I wanted to talk about. Thank you, Dali. Yeah.
Ian, I loved it. It was good. Question for you. What are you doing around L&D? For the organization, for practitioners, to be able to improve spaces, and also in terms of response loops. So, sorry, I've got lots of questions.
Yeah, okay.
In terms of like response loops, so effectively, you've got a developer on the ground who's got a question about a certain piece of thing. How are they effectively coming back to your governance group in order to be able to ensure that they can get answers pretty quickly? And third one, what are you doing with architecture and being able to like identify and do better governance around architecture? Because that was one of the big pieces I was looking at before I left my last gig.
We're not doing much on the architecture side. We have other pieces in the work where we're trying to just make our own data much more easy to use in terms of building event-driven pipelines to get access to the content. And we understand that if we have that in place, we could pass things off to some of these tools. We're having good conversations with potential partners like IBM and Google. We're evaluating those sorts of tool sets. We're looking at Vertex AI. We've got a chat group, and we use Google Office, and so there's like a Google group where we've got this AI sharing group, and we just share lots of information there. I write an almost weekly email as CTO to the developers, product folk, and other people interested. I haven't done that for 3 weeks, but in it I point to links and resources, so it's very organic. But we have had questions around, should we as an organization provide training around things like prompt engineering? And so there's a couple of people from the governance group who are trying to see what kind of training folk in the organization feel they need. But it's still very generative, I would say. Yeah.
Oh, it's interesting because I was actually thinking more about prevention of fear around the implementation of AI, and therefore also being able to close the loop on better use cases. Because the guys on the ground might be able to identify and point out to you, hey, my little area could be useful as a use case.
Oh, yeah. No, we haven't had a huge amount of fear. There's been quite a lot of embracing of it. I mean, the key question, that comes up is this going to replace my job? That always comes up. But we've got a very simple answer, which is, we're already giving you all too much work. This is not a problem. This is not a problem. Yeah. Ian.
Okay. One thing I might challenge you a bit on is when you were talking about the knowledge economy and it's being based on ideas. Mm-hmm. I think that's true, obviously, but I can have all the ideas I want if all I'm doing is sitting at my desk making fun pictures with Dali or whatever. Yeah. It's really the expression of ideas, and I think these words matter because ideas, we don't want to put a ceiling on ideas because this seems like, we want ideas to flourish and grow, but it's the expression of those ideas and the fact that currently we don't really put a greater weight on certain expressions versus others. And those expressions can be accounted for. They can be really regulated and then used to understand how that economy works and to make it successful with others. So
I would definitely commend the person I was talking about is called Julia Lane. She was behind Star Metrics in Australia, I think, has worked at OSTP, and her work looks very much about people as the vehicle of ideas. And so she's looked in the context of, are there networks of folk where expertise gets translated? And that's for her, that ideas, as you said, without the embodiment of how they get enacted in the society are nothing. But for her perspective is it's the people who then operate on those ideas and share them. And she looks at it from that network perspective. It's really good. I'd recommend it. Yeah.
I have a microphone.
Yeah, you do.
Does that mean I can
Yeah.
go?
Yeah.
Thanks, Ian. I was thinking about what you said about blockchain during your talk, and this may sound like a bit of a daft question, but I'll ask it anyway. And
There are no daft questions. Ian.
How are you managing, or has it come up in these conversations about the use cases for AI that, in some sense, are we sort of almost throwing away product development 101, where we think about the problem we want to solve, and it might just so happen that AI is part of the solution, where in this case it seems to be there's a solution, we have to figure out how to use it. Is that a concern that comes up from certain quarters, or are you worried about that? That we're finding applications for solutions rather than focusing on problems.
So, another way to frame that question is: are we taking a technology and trying to shove it into where it can be used? And for sure, in this instance, the answer to that is yes. But in recognition that even in their text manifestation, in terms of how they operate on text, I like this concept of them being calculators for text. Our industry's entire value chain is text. Authorship, peer review, how we think about the marketing materials, how we understand text as data. The entire value chain is text. And so as CTO, one of my remits is to think about what are the technological changes in the landscape that have a particular manifest effect on what we do as an organization. And normally, product development 101 is, okay, think about the problem. People don't buy drills, right? They buy a machine for making holes. That's the classic example. They want a hole. They don't want a drill. If the magic wand that made holes, they would do that, right? So yes, I recognize and respect that. But what we've done is we've pulled in some of the product folks in those conversations and asked some of those questions with a product lens, but being driven by my concern that this is a change that we need to understand, because I think it can have profound effects on that value chain. I'm done, right? I'm going to go down. Thanks.